The summit hall was glowing with golden light, filled with world leaders, business icons, and young innovators waiting for a moment that promised to change history. Cameras clicked, whispers filled the air, and every seat was taken. It was not just another event. It was a place where the future of technology, leadership, and humanity would meet in one hall. All eyes turned when Sundar Pichai slowly walked onto the stage. He looked calm, his steps steady, his face holding the quiet strength of a man who had lived through struggles and victories. For the first 5 minutes, the audience was silent. They wanted to hear what Sundar would say. Many expected only numbers, statistics, and stories of machines and markets. But there was something different in his eyes. Something human. Something that carried the weight of both pain and hope. He began speaking softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I was a boy in India," he said, "we did not have many luxuries. My family lived in a small house. I used to wait for my father to return home from work, and together we would listen to the crackling sound of the radio. Those nights taught me patience. They taught me to believe that even in silence, learning was possible." The hall leaned forward. It was not the usual corporate introduction. It was personal, vulnerable, and real. Sundar paused, looked at the audience, and his eyes became moist for a moment. But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. Prime Minister Modi, sitting in the front row, rose quietly from his chair. The hall gasped. Leaders at global summits did not usually rise in the middle of someone's speech. It was seen as a disruption, a breach of order. Yet Modi stood there, not with arrogance, not with political force, but with a humility that no one expected. He joined his hands in respect, his head slightly bowed. The cameras flashed rapidly. The journalists whispered, unsure how to interpret this moment. Was it a signal? Was it politics? Or was it something much deeper? Sundar's voice trembled as he paused. He had not expected this. The man who led the world's largest democracy, the man many saw as powerful, was showing silent respect in the middle of his speech. It was not scripted. It was not planned. It was a gesture that broke through the walls of protocol. Sundar looked down for a second, gathering himself. The pause stretched. People in the hall felt the air change. They could sense something beyond words. In that silence, hearts connected. Then Sundar continued, this time with a voice deeper, stronger, and filled with gratitude. It is easy to forget where we come from when we stand in front of bright lights. But moments like this remind us that humility is greater than power, respect is stronger than pride, and kindness can travel further than any technology we build. The audience erupted in applause. But inside that applause was not just excitement. It was reflection. People felt their own struggles, their own moments of pride, their own silent battles. A young student from Africa wiped her eyes. A CEO from Europe leaned back, humbled. And somewhere in the corner, a journalist realized that this summit was not going to be about policies or products. It was going to be about humanity. Yet, as the applause continued, there was tension building. Not everyone in the hall felt inspired. Some leaders whispered to each other with doubt. Some thought humility was weakness. Some believed power must always dominate respect. They did not know that this pause, this single act of rising and bowing, would start a chain of events that would test every value in that room. Betrayal, conflict, unexpected voices, and the weight of truth would soon rise. But in that moment, Part 1 ended with one man pausing his speech and another standing with humility, creating silence so powerful that it shook the hall more than thunder ever could. The applause faded slowly, like waves retreating after a storm. Yet the silence that followed was heavier than before. Sundar stood still on the stage, his eyes lowered, his breath steady, but inside him a storm was forming. Modi's humble gesture was not just respect. It was a reminder of his own journey, of the roads he had walked barefoot, of the nights when dreams felt impossible. He raised his head again and spoke, but now his voice carried something different. Many people believe technology is about machines, about codes, about power. But for me, it has always been about people. I think of my mother who saved coins for my studies, of my father who believed in listening more than speaking, and of the countless children across the world who sit under dim lights tonight, holding books with hope. They are the reason I stand here. The hall grew quiet again. Leaders who were used to cold speeches of strategy and control were now hearing the warmth of a man who had not forgotten his roots. And yet beneath that warmth, tension began to spread. At one side of the hall, a group of foreign ministers exchanged sharp looks. One of them whispered, "This is not about humility. This is about image." Another replied, "He is shifting the stage. He is moving the crowd with emotions, not policies. This is dangerous." Sundar felt that resistance even without hearing them. He had lived long enough to know that humility often provoked suspicion, that kindness was sometimes seen as weakness. Still, he went on, "Every summit speaks about the future, but the future will never be safe if we forget respect. Nations cannot stand tall if they crush others with pride. Companies cannot succeed if they only chase profit and forget people. Even a person cannot find peace if he forgets where he came from." The applause returned, louder this time, but in the middle rows sat a man who did not clap. His face was stern, his eyes sharp, and his mind restless. He was a delegate from a powerful country that often measured progress only in terms of dominance. To him, Sundar's words were a threat. He leaned to his aide and said, "Watch this man carefully. He is not only speaking about kindness, he is reshaping influence. That is more dangerous than any policy." As Sundar continued, Modi sat back down, his hands folded, his face calm, but there was something unspoken in his eyes. He had made a gesture that shocked the hall, but it was only the beginning. He knew storms would rise from this. He knew people in the back rooms would plot, would question, would twist the meaning of what had just happened. Yet he also knew that silence and humility sometimes carried more weight than the loudest declarations. Minutes passed, and Sundar shifted his story again. He spoke of the time he first left India for America, with little money in his pocket, carrying only faith and determination. "I remember the first time I used a computer in a classroom," he said. "It was not just a machine, it was a window that showed me what was possible. But even then I felt something stronger. The teacher who patiently guided me, who believed in me. Without her kindness, that window would have remained closed." This story touched hearts in the hall. People leaned closer, forgetting for a moment their positions, their flags, their pride. They remembered their own teachers, their own mentors, their own silent helpers who had lifted them when they were weak. For a brief second, the summit became not about nations, but about humans. And then, a voice broke the spell. From the corner of the press section, a journalist stood and called out, "Mr. Pichai, do you believe humility alone can solve the global challenges we face? What about strength? What about the power required to lead?" The hall turned. It was unusual for someone to interrupt a speech in such a way, but the question hung heavy in the air. Sundar paused again, his eyes narrowing with thought. He could feel the weight of the question. It was not only about him, it was about the very heart of the debate. Humility versus strength, kindness versus control. His answer came slowly but firmly. Strength without humility becomes tyranny. Humility without strength becomes silence. But when strength and humility walk together, nations heal, people rise, and futures open. We do not need to choose one. We need both, held by respect. The words hit the room like a strike of thunder. Some nodded with tears, some frowned with doubt, some whispered with unease. But no one was untouched. In the front row, Modi's eyes glistened. He whispered softly to himself, words only he could hear. "This is why I stood. This is why I bowed." Because true strength is never about standing tallest, it is about lifting others when they fall. The summit, however, was not finished with surprises. At the far end of the hall, another leader pushed his chair back. His movement was sharp, deliberate. He stood up not with humility, but with challenge. All eyes turned. Suspense filled the air. Something was about to break, and the hall braced itself for the unexpected. The hall grew tense as the leader at the far end of the room rose to his feet. He was tall, his shoulders stiff, his eyes filled with authority. Unlike Modi, there was no softness in his gesture. He did not stand in respect. He stood in defiance. The room shifted. Whispers ran through the rows. Cameras pointed sharply toward him. He cleared his throat and his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Pichai," he said, "you speak of humility as if it can move nations. You speak of respect as if it can replace strength. But tell me, when borders are threatened, when economies collapse, When nations rise against nations, what will humility do? Will it shield the weak? Will it stop the powerful? His words echoed, heavy with challenge. Many nodded in agreement. Some leaders smiled faintly, relieved that someone had voiced the thought they themselves had hidden. Humility sounded noble, but to them, the world was about power, survival, and dominance. Sundar looked at the man calmly, but inside his chest, his heart pounded. He knew this was coming. Every time humility was placed on a stage, pride would rise to fight it. He stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium, and answered with steady eyes. Humility does not stop conflict by itself. But without humility, even victory turns into ashes. Power without respect destroys the very people it claims to protect. I am not saying humility replaces strength. I am saying humility gives strength its meaning. The hall stirred. Some clapped quietly, others remained frozen. The leader who had stood did not sit down. Instead, he leaned forward and pointed his finger toward Sundar. Words, he said, are easy. But the world is not built on words. It is built on decisions, on actions, on force when required. Do you think kindness will save a child from hunger? Do you think humility will protect a nation when others seek to exploit it? The question burned like fire. Sundar's lips tightened, and for a moment he was silent. Then he spoke slowly, every word carrying weight. Yes, a hungry child needs food, not only kind words. But the decision to give that food, the choice to care for the hungry, begins with respect. Without humility, leaders will build walls instead of bridges. Without humility, nations will guard their wealth while children starve. Humility is not weakness. It is the seed from which true solutions grow. There was an unexpected shift in the audience. A few leaders who had doubted him now leaned forward, listening more intently. They had faced crises in their own lands and knew that arrogance had never healed the wounds of their people. But others hardened their expressions, refusing to bend. Modi watched carefully. His eyes moved between Sundar and the challenging leader. He knew this moment was dangerous. A summit could collapse if pride consumed the stage. Yet he also knew that sometimes a clash was needed to reveal the truth hidden beneath the surface. The challenging leader spoke again, louder this time, his voice shaking the walls. Let us not pretend. Humility does not build armies. Humility does not sign treaties. Humility does not control markets. Humility cannot lead the world. Only strength can, and strength belongs to those who are willing to take it, not to those who bow their heads. The hall was on edge now. Every face was tense. Some feared the summit would descend into argument and division. Others wanted to see who would win this battle of values. Sundar stood tall, his calmness itself a weapon. He did not shout back. He did not raise his finger. Instead, he let the silence stretch again, making the leader's anger feel heavier. When he finally spoke, his words were like water against stone. You are right, humility does not build armies. But armies built without humility destroy their own people. You are right. Humility does not control markets. But markets without humility crush the poor. Strength without humility is not leadership. It is domination. And domination is never remembered with respect. The words landed hard. The audience gasped softly. The leader's face darkened. He clenched his fist on the table, his knuckles white. But he had no easy answer. And then, unexpectedly, a voice rose from the second row. It was not a leader, not a minister, but a young delegate representing students from across the world. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew strong as she spoke. My village lost everything in a flood, she said. We waited for leaders, for armies, for power to help us. But no one came. It was a small group of people who came quietly, who bowed to us with respect, who brought food and shelter. They had no power, but their humility saved us. So yes, humility can save a child from hunger. It saved me. The hall fell silent again, but this time it was not heavy with tension. It was heavy with truth. Her words pierced through the walls of pride like light through darkness. Even the challenging leader looked unsettled, his gaze flickering away for a moment. Sundar turned toward her, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. Thank you. Your story is the answer better than mine. Humility is not an idea, it is an action. When we bow, we lift others. When we respect, we heal wounds. The world needs this more than ever. Applause broke out again, louder and longer than before, but beneath it the air still carried suspense. The challenging leader had not been silenced. His pride had been wounded, and wounded pride often searched for revenge. In the front row, Modi folded his hands once more, whispering quietly to himself, "Storms will come now, but storms are where true courage is tested." And as the clapping continued, a shadow passed over the summit. The battle between humility and pride was far from over. The hall was alive with the sound of applause, but beneath the surface another current flowed, darker and sharper. Leaders shifted uneasily in their seats, aides whispered into earpieces, journalists scribbled notes with urgency. The words spoken in the last hour had already shaken the summit more than any policy paper could. Humility had been defended, pride had been wounded, and the balance of the room was fragile, as if the wrong word could split it in half. The challenging leader still stood, his jaw locked, his eyes sharp as glass. He did not clap, he did not smile. Instead, he leaned toward his aide and muttered something that no microphone could catch, but his expression told the truth. He was not done. His pride had been cut, and he would not allow it to bleed quietly. Sundar stood at the podium, watching the crowd carefully. He knew what was happening beneath the applause. He had lived long enough in boardrooms and governments to understand that silence sometimes hid daggers. Still, he chose to stand firm, his voice calm, his presence steady. But even as he held the stage, a thought pressed against his mind. How far would pride go to protect itself? Then it began. Another leader, sitting 2 rows behind Modi, slowly rose. This time the room did not gasp, for they had already been prepared for tension. Yet there was something different in his face. He was not filled with anger like the first, but with doubt. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke carefully. "Mr. Pichai," he said, "your words are moving, and no one here can deny the beauty of humility. But nations do not run on beauty. We have responsibilities to our people, to our allies, to our futures. If humility becomes our guiding principle, will it not make us vulnerable? Will it not open doors for stronger nations to control weaker ones? Respect is noble, but history has shown us that respect is not always returned." What then? The hall shifted again. This was not anger, but it was a dangerous question. It was the voice of fear, the voice that often guided policies, the voice that whispered that kindness was risky. Many nodded quietly, their hearts agreeing, though their lips stayed silent. Sundar let the question hang for a long moment. He did not rush. He looked down, his hands resting on the podium, his mind searching for the right words. Then he raised his head, his eyes sweeping across the hall, and spoke with slow clarity. Yes, respect is not always returned. Yes, humility can be mocked. Yes, fear exists, and it has shaped history more times than hope. But ask yourselves, has fear ever built peace that lasted? Has pride ever built bridges that stood? We may protect ourselves with walls, but in the end, those walls trap us. Humility does not guarantee safety, but it guarantees humanity. Without it, even when we win, we lose what makes us human. His words struck like quiet thunder. The audience leaned forward. Even those who doubted him felt the truth pressing against their hearts. Still, not all were convinced. From the back of the hall, another voice rose, this time sharp, impatient. "These are just stories," the voice said. "We are leaders, not philosophers. This is a summit, not a classroom. We came here for agreements, for trade, for strategies, not for tales of childhood radios and teachers. With all respect, Mr. Pichai, are you here to guide the future or to drown us in sentiment?" The hall went cold. The words were blunt, almost cruel. They carried the tone of someone who wanted to strip the moment of its meaning, to drag it back into the hard floor of politics. The applause died instantly. Even the air seemed still. Sundar's chest tightened, but he did not show it. He let the silence last longer than before. The journalists leaned in, ready to write whatever would follow. The young delegate who had spoken earlier looked nervous, biting her lip, afraid the conversation was slipping away from the fragile truth she had shared. And then, in that silence, something unexpected happened again. Modi moved once more. He did not stand this time, but he raised his hand gently, asking for the microphone. The moderator hesitated. Protocol dictated leaders speak only in turns, but the weight of the gesture was undeniable. Slowly, the microphone was passed to him. The hall turned as Modi began to speak, his voice steady, humble, carrying both simplicity and depth. "I bowed earlier," he said softly. "Not to a man, but to a lesson." When Sundar spoke of his childhood, I remembered mine. I remembered selling tea at the railway station, watching people rush past, none knowing my name, none caring who I was. If at that time someone had told me that humility was weakness, I would not have survived. It was respect, the respect I gave even when I received none, that shaped me. It taught me patience, it taught me resilience, and it gave me the strength to stand here today. The room was frozen. The Prime Minister of India had just spoken of his own childhood struggle in front of the entire world. Not with pride, but with humility. No one had expected it. Leaders who had come prepared with speeches about power and markets now found themselves confronted by something deeper, something raw. Modi continued, his tone unshaken. "We speak of policies, of agreements, of strategies, but what are these without respect? What is trade without trust? What is power without humility? We must remember, we are not just leaders of nations. We are caretakers of humanity, and humanity cannot survive without kindness." The hall erupted into applause once again, but this time it was different. It was not forced, not polite, not hesitant. It was heavy, emotional, almost desperate. Many clapped with tears in their eyes. Some stood, some bowed their heads. Yet even as the applause thundered, the first challenging leader's face grew darker. He whispered again to his aide, his voice sharp and cold. "Enough. If this continues, the summit will turn into a sermon. They must be reminded who truly holds power here." His words were like a shadow moving across the light. He had not surrendered. He was preparing something. Sundar sensed it. Modi sensed it. The young delegate sensed it. The hall was united for now, but unity was fragile. Pride was not finished. It was waiting, preparing, ready to strike again in a way no one expected. The applause still thundered, echoing against the high marble walls of the summit hall. But beneath the sound, something darker moved. Leaders who had felt touched by Sundar's words and Modi's humility now sat with softened eyes, but not all were swayed. Some clapped only for appearance, hiding their clenched jaws behind the noise. And in one corner, the first challenging leader leaned back in his chair, his expression hard, his lips pressed into a line as sharp as steel. His aide bent close, whispering, and he nodded with the kind of certainty that carried danger. Sundar stood at the podium, his heart heavy yet strong. He could feel the fragile balance of the summit. One wrong step, one careless word, and everything could shatter. But he also knew that sometimes truth had to walk directly into conflict. He glanced toward Modi, who gave him a small nod, a gesture of silent courage. It told him, "Do not fear the storm." Sometimes the storm reveals what calm cannot. Then it happened. The challenging leader rose again, but this time he did not stand alone. Two other leaders stood with him, their suits gleaming under the lights, their faces stern. The hall gasped softly. This was no longer one man's opposition. This was a side forming, a wall being built against humility itself. He raised his voice, louder than before, carrying authority like a hammer. "Enough of these tales of childhood and kindness," he declared. "We are gathered here not to weep, but to decide. If we let humility guide our path, we will be exploited by stronger nations. If we bow our heads, others will place their boots upon our necks. This summit must choose strength, not weakness. And strength comes from fear, from control, from knowing that no one can challenge us." His words struck the air like fire. Applause did not follow. Instead, silence spread, thick and suffocating. Many leaders looked down at their hands, unsure which side to take. Some feared the truth of his words. Others feared the consequences of resisting them. It was a dangerous silence, the kind that cracks unity and breeds division. Sundar inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He wanted to answer, but before he could speak, something unexpected happened. The challenging leader motioned to his aide, who stepped forward carrying a folder. Inside it were documents, carefully prepared, meant to be revealed at this very moment. He slammed the folder onto the table and spoke again, his voice sharp. "These are reports from intelligence sources. They show that nations which showed too much trust, too much humility, were betrayed in alliances. They were crushed in markets. They lost everything. History proves that kindness is not strength. History proves that respect is a mask that others wear only until they strike. Gasps echoed through the hall. The journalists scribbled furiously, some even standing to take better notes. The aides of other leaders exchanged nervous glances. The folder, thick with papers, became a symbol of pride's weapon. Facts twisted into fear, evidence painted with shadows. Sundar felt the room tilt. If he stayed silent, pride would win. If he shouted, humility would lose its voice. He closed his eyes for a brief second, remembering the nights of his childhood when silence carried more meaning than noise. Then he opened them, lifted his head, and stepped forward. "You hold reports," he said softly, "but I hold memories. You show papers of betrayal, but I carry faces of those who were lifted by kindness. History is not only made by wars and markets, it is also made by moments when people chose compassion over fear. Those stories are not written in folders, but in hearts. And those hearts keep the world alive," the leader sneered. "Hearts do not sign treaties. Hearts do not defend borders. Hearts do not win battles." Sundar paused, then looked directly at him. "But hearts are why treaties are signed. Hearts are why borders exist. Hearts are why battles are fought, and why peace is worth seeking at all. Without hearts, you may have nations, but you will not have humanity." A murmur spread through the hall. Some leaders nodded slowly, others bit their lips. The young delegate who had spoken earlier pressed her hands together, her eyes filled with tears. Modi closed his eyes briefly, whispering a silent prayer for strength. The challenging leader, however, was not moved. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising to a roar. "If this summit continues down this path, it will fail. Nations must choose fear over weakness, strength over softness. I propose we end this charade and move directly to resolutions that secure power, not stories that waste time." His words created a crack that split the hall. Some leaders applauded him, others shook their heads. Voices rose, arguments began, and for the first time the summit teetered on the edge of chaos. The moderator tried to call for order, but the storm had begun. Two sides were forming. One for strength without humility, one for strength with humility. The hall buzzed like a battlefield before the first clash. Sundar gripped the podium, his knuckles white. He had never imagined the summit would descend this far, but he also knew this was the true test. He could feel his voice trembling inside him, waiting to rise. But before he could speak, Modi leaned forward, his face calm, his hands still folded. He whispered, just loud enough for Sundar to hear, "Sometimes silence is power. Let them fight. Then speak with humility that cuts through their noise." The noise grew louder, leaders shouting, interpreters rushing, aides waving documents. Pride was roaring now, and it seemed humility would be drowned. And yet in the corner, the young delegate slowly rose again. Her voice was small, almost invisible against the shouting. But then she said a single sentence that made the hall pause. "If leaders cannot choose humility," she whispered, "then maybe it is time the people teach them what it means." The room froze. The shouting died. Her words hung in the air like a fragile light, daring to survive the storm. The young delegate's voice still lingered in the air, delicate yet unshakable. Her words had sliced through the roaring debate like a whisper cutting stone. The leaders who had been shouting only moments earlier froze, their eyes turning toward her. She was not a president, not a prime minister, not a CEO. She was just a student, representing millions of unheard voices from villages, towns, and forgotten streets. Yet in that hall, her single sentence carried more weight than the thickest folders of documents. The challenging leader's lips tightened. His eyes burned with irritation, but for the first time he did not speak immediately. He had been confronted not by another politician, but by truth dressed in innocence. Pride could fight power with power, but against humility spoken by a voice so young, his anger stumbled. The silence stretched. The journalists' cameras flashed, capturing every angle of her trembling hands and determined eyes. Aides stood frozen, their notes forgotten. Even the moderator sat still, realizing the moment had slipped beyond rules and schedules. Sundar stepped forward. His eyes softened as he looked at the young woman. "You are right," he said gently. "Leaders argue about policies, but it is the people who carry the weight of those decisions. If we forget humility, we forget the people. And if we forget the people, then no summit, no treaty, no resolution has meaning." The hall shifted. His words, tied to her voice, pulled the attention back to the essence of the gathering. Modi leaned forward, his expression glowing with quiet pride. He raised his hand once more, asking to speak. The microphone was passed, and his voice flowed steady, filled with memory and fire. "I have seen power up close," he said. "I have seen how it can build and how it can destroy. But I have also seen something stronger than power. The resilience of people who survive because they help each other, not because someone commanded them. Humility is not weakness. Humility is the language of humanity. And today, in this hall, I bow again not to a man, not to a nation, but to the spirit of respect that binds us." And then, before anyone could react, Modi rose to his feet once more and bowed deeply toward the young delegate. It was a gesture no one had predicted. The Prime Minister of India bowing to a student. It shattered protocol. It tore through centuries of hierarchy. It turned the meaning of leadership upside down. The hall gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others rose to their feet in shock. The young delegate's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling as she tried to bow back. But Modi stopped her gently with his hand raised. "No," he said softly. "You have already bowed by speaking truth. Now it is our turn to listen." The atmosphere cracked open. The applause that followed was unlike anything the hall had ever heard. It was not polite, not staged, not mechanical. It was raw, overwhelming, and unstoppable. People clapped with tears in their eyes. Leaders stood, some bowing their heads, some even placing their hands on their hearts. But in the corner, the challenging leader still sat, his fists clenched. The noise of applause struck him like waves against stone. Yet even he could not escape the weight of what had unfolded. He looked at the young delegate, then at Modi, then at Sundar. His pride held him silent, but inside something small shifted. Not enough to admit defeat, but enough to recognize that the room had changed forever. Sundar stepped to the podium for the final time. His voice was strong now, carrying both steel and tenderness. "We began this summit with numbers, strategies, and fears. But what we have discovered is something greater. Humility is not against strength. Humility gives strength its purpose. Respect does not erase power. Respect makes power worth having, and kindness is not weakness. Kindness is the only thing that keeps humanity alive." His words echoed like a hymn. The hall was silent again, but this silence was not heavy with conflict. It was sacred, alive, and filled with unity. Leaders who had come with speeches about trade now scribbled new notes about dignity. Journalists who had expected drama now wrote about transformation. The challenging leader finally rose, not in anger this time, but with a slow, reluctant dignity. He did not bow, but he nodded once, stiffly, toward Sundar and Modi. It was not surrender, but it was acknowledgement, and that in itself was a victory. As the summit drew to a close, the cameras captured the image that would live in history. Sundar standing tall at the podium, Modi bowing with folded hands toward the young delegate, and the hall of leaders united, however briefly, under the quiet strength of humility. The world outside would analyze it, argue about it, twist it in newsrooms and debates. But those who were present would never forget what they had seen. They would never forget how humility rose against pride, how respect silenced anger, how kindness found its voice in the quiet courage of a young delegate. As the lights dimmed and the hall slowly emptied, Sundar looked once more at the student. He smiled softly and whispered words that only she could hear. "Never believe your voice is too small. Sometimes it is the smallest voice that carries the loudest truth." She nodded, tears still in her eyes, and in that moment the summit's true legacy was sealed. Not in documents, not in signatures, but in hearts awakened.